A little over 12 years ago, my 22-year-old sister Wendy was shot point blank in the head with a handgun. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a 19-year-old girl with a desire for some quick cash had a weapon that didn't belong to her. I was 26, teetering on the verge of my post-grad real life of adventure when everything changed. I became an unwilling expert on police procedure and the criminal justice system. I was now officially the victim of a violent crime, so much so that the state of California was paid for my grief counseling. And I had to learn to become an only sibling, how to live the rest of my life without my vibrant younger sister. That one bullet's path put me on a new and different trajectory, as swiftly and as surely as if it had exited the barrel and sliced through my own body when it went through hers. I never knew much about guns. They weren't something we really grew up with, despite living in Texas. Even as I moved to LA in the early 90s, amidst a time of riots and cultural warfare, gun violence was still far removed from my sheltered existence. I'd never held one that had anything much more dangerous than a BB pellet or water in its chamber. I didn't like guns, but to be honest, I just didn't pay much attention to them. Several years after I arrived in LA, my sister followed suit, transferring to Occidental College for her junior and senior years. We moved into a house together, and I went to grad school. She had a fascination with guns and liked to go to the range and shoot. I remember her coming home one day and taping her target to her bedroom door, proud of her bullseye that shot through the chest of a faceless paper man. I think she liked the power, and that made her seem like a badass. I was more of a joiner and rule follower, but Wendy was a rebel. Come with me sometime, she'd often say. I never did. About 3 weeks before she was killed, she came home one evening shaken. Someone had brandished a gun at her out a car window while she was stopped in an intersection in Hollywood. Don't tell Mom and Dad, she said, they'll flip. She was part scared, part exhilarated by her near miss. Oh my God, what'd you do? My stomach felt full of Mexican jumping beans. Nothing like that had ever happened to me. I floored it. I ran through the red light. I'm fine, but seriously, don't tell Mom and Dad. I didn't. Not until after. It was one more thing to add to the pile of survivor's guilt I would later have to dig through. But I know now that it wouldn't have mattered. 2 separate events, unrelated except by coincidence. How could either of us have known that she would again be face to face with a similar weapon and, despite her cooperation, would not have a chance to escape? Just weeks later, in a moment late at night, parked outside a friend's apartment, my sister sat in a car with a gun again aimed at her head, while her 2 friends begged the girl with the gun to not hurt anyone. And then, after a loud crack and gunpowder and blood, begged the girl with the gun not to kill them too. The power of that weapon I spent so little time thinking about became all my reality. The police never found the murder weapon, but they didn't need it. A slew of other evidence, eyewitness testimonials, 2 years of hearings, trials led to guilty convictions. The indelible images of my sister's postmortem photographs were burned into the backs of my retinas. When I found my voice again, I had something to say about guns, especially ones that end up in the hands of non-law-abiding citizens and criminally negligent people who have no sense of the gravity of the shiny thing they hold in their palm. A gun gives everyone a chance to play God. A 19-year-old who's handed a gun by her uncle was suddenly the decision maker over my sister's mortality. It should never be that easy. Over the next several years, advocating for stronger gun ownership laws and more gun safety education would become a personal platform. I began to speak at events around the country and served on the LA advisory board for the Brady campaign for the prevention of gun violence. I would tell anyone who would listen about what a handgun can do when someone treats it like a toy. But I still never have seen one closer than across the courtroom glass. never held one in my hand, never pulled a trigger. I had a strong argument, sure, but it was one-sided. For the next several years, I talked a good game. I'd learned to shoot, I told people. Everyone should know how to shoot a gun. But I never did. Then early in the fall, as the 10-year anniversary of my sister's death approached, the opportunity presented itself. I was dating a soldier, a sniper with the U.S. Special Forces. And he was as comfortable and familiar with guns as I was afraid of them. We were an unlikely pair in many ways, but I think I was drawn to him because we both stared death in the face. I was in Dallas to visit shortly before I moved back here, and he offered to teach me to shoot. I said yes before I could think about it too much. As we filled out our paperwork at the gun range, I watched the steady hand of my soon-to-be firing instructor tick off expert in each of the categories. Have you done this before? The man behind the counter slid the same paper towards me. No, I whispered, and my hand trembled a little, making my writing shaky. I marked beginner over and over, and took comfort in the fact that I was in the company of a professional. His energy was calm, and it steadied me as much as anything could have at that moment. We donned the prerequisite eye and ear protection before heading into the range. I held the gun uploaded first and thought it was essentially harmless. It caused my hands to go clammy and my heart to pound. It was a different model, but this was the thing that killed my sister. He showed me how to chamber the bullets and position myself in front of the target. I tried my best to focus on the process and distance myself from the potential outcome. It worked for a moment, until I took aim and pulled the trigger for the first time. A sharp recoil accompanied the loud crack as the bullet rocketed out of its chamber. That was when the shaking started in earnest, and I broke out in a cold sweat. I placed the gun on the shelf and took several steps back to catch my breath. "You okay?" the sniper asked me. I willed my heart to beat normally. Yes? No? I think so. My words tumbled over each other. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I suddenly knew, if nothing else, the gravity of holding a loaded handgun. I knew the fine line when the trigger hits its release point. I felt the strength of the gun as it kicked in my hands, wanting to be free of me. And then I just couldn't imagine all over again how anyone could do what that girl did to my sister. I was holding the cold, hard weight of life and death in my palm. There was nothing simple about that gun other than its sleek lines. And Wendy was right about the power. I suddenly got how mastering that weapon could make you feel pretty badass. But I was right too. A gun should never be in the hands of someone who doesn't understand exactly what they are holding. It should never be in the hands of someone who just thinks it's cool or fun, or that it gives them the right to control the fate of another. It turns out I didn't need to fire a gun to find that out. We stayed for an hour or so, and I only fired a handful of rounds. That first shot was probably my best, and I think it was because it took that first pull for reality to set in. But I sucked it up and forced myself to shoot again and again, grateful for my patient teacher guiding me into the correct position. Because as it turns out, I did need to fire that gun to face my fear. It's been a couple years now since that afternoon. A few weeks ago, the gun range we were at burned down. The pictures on the news tugged at me a little. Not sadness exactly, but I was tied to that place. I hadn't realized it at the time, but that unconventional date at the range with someone who holds only a small part of my history was a gift. The shock of the gun rocking in my palm as each bullet sped away towards its target connected me to my sister, to her death, and to the things that I now fight for. It made me more well-rounded speaker on the subject of gun violence. It didn't cure me of my fear, but it did bring me a step closer. It didn't make me a badass, but I do think it made Wendy proud, wherever she is, because I am a victim of gun violence, but I am also a fighter.